Hey, Brassfax here. Today we're going to be talking about red dots, LPVOs, and the ACOG stack. Which makes sense for what situation, what some excel at, what some don't excel at, what some suck at. A couple of things we need to know before we get started, because you know how I do. I need my 10 minutes of prologue before we get into the video. So starting off, all these options are basically 90% of the way there. We're just discussing that last 10% of performance and a lot of what people in the gun industry kind of lament over, and hopefully I can add something to the conversation. So I would have no problem running any of these setups, and I have run many of these setups. I have minimal magnification red dot footage because that's something I did before I started the channel and I've kind of moved away from, though I am coming back with that for some reviews. It's worth noting I certainly have preferences here, and you should not view this as a guide on, hey, do this, this, or this. You should more view it as my experience regarding these optical choices. Thus, you can kind of better inform yourself and compare and contrast to what you think, so you can make a better choice with which option you want. Ultimately, the best choice is to try all of them, but people generally don't have the time or money or inclination to do something like that. And I do, so hopefully I can add some value added here. Finally, realize there's a huge range of stuff I'm technically covering here because ACOG, LPVO, and red dot and magnifier cover the vast majority of options available to us on the market, so I'm gonna have to leave out stuff. Also, when I say wide-reaching statements, there obviously is always an optic that deviates from the norm, but typically this either costs us literal cost or it costs something else that optic typically does have from the table. I'm probably going to have to revisit this video at some day and do individual videos on a per category basis where I can talk about specific options on the market like the SIG magnifiers, the Hall-Sun magnifiers, the Vortex magnifiers, and I can kind of discuss each category in isolation, but this is just a wide encompassing video to kind of help you out. Let's get started. The LPVOs. Most people are pretty familiar with LPVOs, but in case you aren't, LPVO stands for Low Power Variable Optics. They're one of the newer offerings and offer variable magnification. You spin the thing in the back, just like your granddad's hunting scope, and you go through the magnification range. What sets the LPVO apart is the inclusion of a 1x bottom end setting. So basically you're looking through a sheet of glass. Not literally, but you also have a higher magnification setting, usually 4, 6, 8, or 10x. This allows versatility of having the 1x option, up close shooting, but allows the user to dial through the variable range of magnification depending on the task at hand. So what are the benefits of running an LPVO? The LPVO, as many have heard, are the jack of all trades, and the best way to consider it is the LPVO has the flattest performance curve, offering both acceptable 1x, acceptable medium magnification, and acceptable to weak long-range magnification. And compared to all the other options here, there isn't a huge discrepancy between all of the performance ranges. They also, by far, no questions asked, have the most versatile reticle options, with the LPVOs offering the full gambit at this time of different reticle options for your needs. BDC, Mills, MOA, Christmas tree reticles, BDCs with Christmas trees, you name it, right? There's a lot of options on the market, and honestly, probably too many options on the market at this point. Specifically, some of the Christmas tree BDC with Windhold reticles and Milrad style reticles offer the performance of higher magnification scopes while still retaining a native 1x system. That's really good. It offers answers to a lot of the tactical questions you wonder with these higher magnification setups. All LPVOs, by their inherent nature, with some exceptions, are batteryless designs. Granted, they literally do have a battery and can make use of a battery, but considering most LPVOs only have like 15 hours of battery life, and turning back into a batteryless design, I think we can call it that. But because of that etched reticle, we never need illumination. It's just nice to have and makes it shoot and behave a little better in certain conditions. There are some notable exceptions that trade their 1x performance to get a good 10x or 8x reticle. However, on the 1x setting, the reticle is so fine, specifically in first focal plane, that you actually do end up needing an illumination setting. I typically don't think these scopes are acceptable for regular usage. And on that note of reticles, to me, etched reticles typically offer a superior aiming point over a red dot in anything other than 1x settings, because the distinct hard lines of an etched reticle with black leaves no ambiguity, while a red dot kind of has a degree of ambiguity in terms of where on the target you are, specifically talking about when you're shooting at a very fine target. There's also a lot of flexibility with the LPVO. Let's say you have a 1 to 8x, which are becoming more and more popular. You have your 1x setting, obviously, but you can dial up to 3, 4, or 5x to kind of scan or use at just closer ranges. Contrary to what a lot of people say, there is utility in using the lower magnification settings. For example, you're engaging multiple targets at 200, 300 yards in a run and gun style setting. 8x is absolutely way too much, and you'll get lost in the sauce and lose your target often. However, 4 or 5x, well, that's just right on the money of what you need. And you still, once again, have that 8x for different styles of shooting, long-range shooting, zeroing, observation, whatever. We don't have that flexibility with the other options on this list. Similarly, when you're scanning, you're looking for a target, you can dial back to, let's say, 3x or 4x and look around with a relatively wide field of view. You see what you're looking for, zoom all the way in, engage the target. The LPVO also, in my eyes, typically offers the best system for weird lighting conditions. The etched reticle, of all the options, typically is most resilient to variable lighting systems. So for example, you're shooting in a room with a lot of flashlights. The etched reticle tends to last longest without being blown out, especially if you have backup illumination. Transient lighting conditions, for example, looking into a bright area from a dark area, or vice versa, the etched reticle once again seems to hang around longer. Now there is absolutely a case where red dots can be better than the LPVO, but typically if you're in a dark environment, you will have your red dot dimmed. So when you look into a bright environment, it washes out, and thus you have to adjust it. Now the red dot will become better than the LPVO once adjusted, but the LPVO starts at a very good baseline and doesn't require modifications on the go. Let's get into the cons, because it's not always the correct solution to have an LPVO. The big thing to me is LPVOs, for starters, are just the most expensive options. Yes, there are budget options on the market that are quite capable, but this is very much a category where you get what you pay for, especially when we consider the other options on the list. And while, say, with an ACOG and an RDS, which is generally an expensive initial setup, once you buy that, you have the best in slot, best in category option. That amount of money for an LPVO, congratulations, you're just getting started, right? There are a lot of expensive LPVOs out there, and to a degree, you're always going to be chasing performance with an ever-increasing cost. You're going to be led down a very expensive, unsatisfying rabbit hole with LPVOs, because LPVOs are, by their very nature, imperfect and while they represent a very flat performance curve, right? There's no really bad stuff and no really good stuff. The ability to raise that performance across the board is very expensive to do. They are neither great long-range scopes nor great red dots, and in order to improve that, it's quite difficult. LPVOs, by their very nature, are also just terrible night vision devices, by far in any of the categories here. Now, while you can focus the LPVO to your night vision device or your night vision device to your LPVO, it is imperfect. And at the end of the day, even if you can get it all to line up well, you've unfocused your scope or your night vision, or you're still looking through a scope, so your actual available light coming in is very limited, and you can really only do this in well-lit environments. Finally, you're in a weird paradox where, air quotes, good LPVO eye reliefs make it very hard to shoot under night vision, right? Because 4 inches of eye relief makes sense when it's at your eyeball, but now add a multi-inch tube in front of your eye, and you have to put that at the 4-inch eye relief. There might not actually be enough stock for you to do that. Moving on. LPVOs are heavy. Now, there are lightweight LPVO options on the market, but then you actually do a comparison and realize the lightest LPVO is still typically on par or heavier than the heavy other options. And that doesn't exclude the fact that some of the good LPVO options weigh a shitload. So you notice when you have an LPVO on your system. Finally, this is a bit of a weird one to quantify, but it bears mentioning. LPVOs are kind of all over the place. There are a lot of really bad LPVOs on the market, and there's a lot of very good LPVOs on the market. The reason there are so many bad LPVOs, some of it is just, selling to a consumer that probably won't use their LPVO, but some of it is the fact that LPVOs are ridiculously hard to pull off, because the strength and point of an LPVO is that you have that flat performance curve. Good 1x, good 3x, good 5x, good 8x, or whatever x. But the thing is, an LPVO needs all of these. So it's a large margin for failure. You have to nail every single one of the performance metrics. It has to have functional eye box. Your head placement has to be same throughout the entire magnification range. It has to stay focused throughout the entire magnification range. You need clear glass on both ends. It needs to work at 1x. The reticle needs to work at 1x, 8x, 5x, whatever. Right? So it's very easy to mess up an LPVO where such that an other option might make more sense. And that's something that you have to contend with when getting into LPVOs. There may not be the right LPVO for you out there, especially when you consider cost. So yeah, that's about it. You get a middle-of-the-road package that performs acceptably in all ranges. There are no wonky aiming methods. Face goes in the same place every single time. Put the lever where you want your magnification and pull the trigger. Next up, red dots and magnifiers. I'm only going to consider these in conjunction because remember, this list is my list. This is what I consider, and I don't really run red dots by themselves on rifles. So you've seen probably my most popular video, so you've probably seen it by now. But I believe magnification is borderline mandatory for civilian rifles outside of home defense, so I will include magnifiers here as an absolute. The logic of the red dot magnifier is that you want to heavily lean on the 1x because that's probably what you're going to be doing most of the time. A lot of your shooting is going to occur at 1x, and while I believe that is more of a factor because people train a lot at ranges where 1x makes sense, and magnification is going to be far more prevalent than most people think, the reality is you're still going to do a lot at 1x. And here you have a uncompromised, purpose-built 1x, and that's worth something. With the advent of the Holosun, SIG, and even more entering basically by the day, red dots, even the very cheap ones, perform really well at their task of being a red dot. That's not true with LPVOs. There are absolutely LPVOs on the market that are just should not exist. But basically all red dots on the market kind of hit the metric I've mentioned above and are quite good. So what does a RDS bring to the table? Well, like I said, it has the purpose-built 1x. Remember, the LPVO is a flat curve? Well, think about this. This one has the best 1x option on the market, capped out at 1x, right? No matter what red dot you choose, no matter what cheap-ass piece of crap you choose, even the MRO, which has become the new favorite thing to hate, even an MRO beats the snot out of a 1x on most LPVOs. Even with the most ass-fucked eye positioning, head positioning, whatever, your parallax, your sight picture, everything is superior to a scoped option. This makes the red dot the fastest and easiest to use out of all of these options. Though I would say it's not nearly as intense as you think, especially on the speed category. The red dot also adds a lot of utility that the other options may not have. Namely, the EOTech, the Holosun Aims, the Aimpoint T2, or the Comp M4, M5 have very good night vision performance. And should you want night vision performance, this is actually the only option available to you, and you basically are locked into this category. That's why we see red dot setups predominantly on operators' firearms, right? Because there's a expectation of good CQB performance and good backup for passive aiming for if you go up against an adversary with night vision. The magnification is added cherry on top, right? But their number one goal is that 1x and that night vision performance, hence the focus towards this particular setup. When we do add that magnifier on, with not that much more, we gain a lot. We kind of cover the shortfalls of just having a 1x, and while not typically great at long range due to the lack of a complex reticle design, it is heavily mitigated by the fact that you can generally just have a battle zero and have a fairly tight spread out to relevant ranges. This ends up speaking to the fact that the reality is a lot of people that buy LPVOs, but then only buy an LPVO that has a ludicrously simplistic reticle, but red dot bright performance, and then decide, hey, I'm just going to have a battle type zero. You know what optics I'm talking about. These style of optics, I would argue in a lot of cases, the people that want to do that with their LPVO would actually be far better served with a red dot sight, because at the end of the day, LPVOs don't have batteries worth of shit, and you're really just chasing red dot performance without getting the benefits of an LPVO. So another win for the red dot magnifier combo. Looking at the magnifier specifically, typically these are actually not terribly expensive, and even the most expensive magnifier isn't awful. And you don't even need to buy it right away. If you really want a buy once, cry once setup, but you're running a little tight on money, you could potentially just buy the red dot and then buy the magnifier later, letting you sort of tier up over time. Most magnifiers are also quick to attach, meaning you can remove it on the spot and lighten your rifle, hand it off to someone else that might want to take the shot instead, stow it, or use it as a monocular for yourself or for someone else, right? Like, hey, I'm looking at this thing, here you go. Can you see it? Oh yeah, I can see it. So it's got some added utility there. It's also separate. So in an event where your rifle takes a hard tumble, the most delicate part, the box with the glass in it, can break and you still have a functional aiming system. This is not true with an LPVO. Furthermore, and probably most importantly, magnifiers versus anything else on this list suffer from minimal zero and parallax shift because of the very nature of being slaved behind a red dot. This cannot be understated. LPVOs, ACOGs, you name it, have noticeable parallax, and if you're not doing your part, you will miss shots at range that you otherwise wouldn't due to this shift. Let's get into the cons. Because you're going to be spending a lot of time at the 1x, that's great, right? We have a really good 1x setting, but your magnifier in most setups will be hanging off the side of your rifle. For some people, they don't care. Personally, for me, I find it annoying. It obstructs my field of view and my both eyes open shooting and very wide head positioning. It gets in the way when I'm slung up, and it bounces off of objects and stuff when I go into weird positions. Is it a deal breaker? No, but it's annoying. You can get around this by using something like a Unity riser, but that's a very specific setup, and that's a whole nother video in itself, and I don't want to get into that. Most magnifiers are kind of imperfect in a lot of ways and leave a lot to be desired, right? Even as you go up in price, you still have eye box issues, you still have clarity issues, you still have light transmission issues, you still have durability or weight issues depending on what models. It really doesn't feel like an option on the market that it just kind of nails it all. From what I've seen so far, and I've talked to Hoplifile about this, so this is more his thing, but he does a lot more magnifier red dots in the modern market, and the reality is there is seemingly almost no perfect solution. The old EOTech magnifiers were great, but they're kind of dated in terms of glass quality and especially price. The Aimpoint magnifier is phenomenal, but it literally costs more than most rifles. Was it $1,200? They have the C version, but that's kind of depressing and it's not even that great in the grand scheme of things. Then you have the SIG magnifiers, which are seemingly actually quite good in terms of glass quality, but they kind of weigh a lot. Moving down to the lighter weight ones, there's cheaper magnifiers like the Holosun and the Vortex VM3X or whatever it's called. They have durability issues with their mount. Not the glass, but with the mount. And that's kind of a concern when the leading edge of your rifle is not the most durable thing, right? Because typically it's going to be clicked out. With both of those options, I've had the mount fail after not too long. You also lose the versatility with your magnifier combo if you go up to the higher magnification range. I would argue generally 3x or 4x is all you really need for a magnifier red dot combo. However, if you want more magnification, you can get it with like a 6x Juliet, like from SIG. But those are quite expensive, and they kind of forget the fact that in reality, you probably don't actually want a fixed 6x on the top end. When you're doing run and gun, shooting on the shooting in variable positions, so on and so forth, you typically don't want 5x, 6x, 7x, and definitely not 8x. That's too much. And the versatility of an LPVO being able to dial to anywhere in your magnification range is actually a useful boon, and I would argue 6x on a magnifier is too much. Thus, a downside of the magnifier is simply that higher magnifications don't generally always make sense on these setups. Finally, most importantly to me, if we ignore EOTechs for a second, the sight picture you see at the higher magnification settings is undesirable or not great in my eyes. Does it work? Yeah, absolutely. But let's just say we put a Holosun in front of our 4x magnifier. Great at 1x, absolutely. But we flip that magnifier over and we have a 2 MOA dot. And a 2 MOA dot, while great for 1x, is really big when you get past about 300 yards shooting at small targets. And combined with the fact that it's not nearly as precise as a etched reticle, you begin to have issues with precision. Is it terrible? No, it works. I have videos of me engaging out to 500 yards with a red dot. But it is less than optimal in my opinion. You'll find yourself often dimming the red dot such that you can kind of see through the dot and gain some of that precision back. And that is unoptimal for a setup that touts itself as being able to swap quickly back and forth. Now you can overcome some of these issues, right? The fact that a red dot is generally too big in my eyes, the 2 MOA, right? That's generally like 60% of a target at 300 yards, maybe slightly less. You can get around that with something like an EOTech. Because the EOTech offers a small dot in the center, I think it's about half MOA, it works really well under a magnifier. But you end up paying the EOTech tax. What is the EOTech tax? Well, it's the abysmal battery life. This is generally actually overstated as to how bad it is, having owned multiple EOTechs, but it's also not inconsequential. And to me, on a rifle where I expect to have it on a good percentage of its life, this is a huge pain in the ass. I have a lot on my plate should I be using a rifle outside of home defense, and dealing with a rifle system that consumes a non-insignificant part of my reserve of Sierra 123s or AAs is not something I really want to deal with if I don't have to deal with it. The Holosun as an alternative, which also has a circle dot reticle, it's not a true circle dot reticle like an EOTech because the center dot is still handled by the same emitter that does the dot. Thus, it's a circle dot, but the center dot is 2 MOA, and we're back to square one. There are other options on the market like reticled red dots, but those are also imperfect and a compromise and move towards the LPVO thing while giving up red dot things. They have less battery life, though not typically significantly less so, but they give up a lot of the 1x usability. Check out my Holosun ACSS review if you want to get more into that. But the short of it is, the Holosun ACSS is probably the best option on the market. And while I think it leaves a lot to be desired at the 1x, it's far more clear and crisp than the SIG option, which to me has a superior reticle, but kind of looks like shit under magnification. The EOTech, yeah, we keep coming back to those EOTechs. The 3-2, the 3-3, and the 3-4, while they do have a reticle design and offer the clearest reticle design, once again, we have that EOTech tax, and for many people, that's non-negotiable. A good way to view the red dot magnifier combo, though not entirely, is sort of an inverse of an ACOG, and I'll get back to that, but the red dot focuses all of its points, so to speak, its budget, on having a great 1x, but it gives up on the magnification and having the worst magnification in my eyes compared to the other options. So if magnification is at all a priority, I typically look elsewhere. So speaking of the ACOG, let's hit up the final category. The ACOG to me is a all-in on weight, durability, and magnification. Inverse of the red dot, almost. So while on paper the ACOG actually is pretty poor on the magnification front, right? There's a lot of magnifiers that actually beat out the standard ACOGs. To me, it's precisely the correct amount of magnification I want on a fighting rifle, and that's pretty nice. You combine it with both the large actual field of view, how much you see, and the apparent field of view, how much of your visual horizon it takes up, which is specific to the TA-31, you get something that is very, very usable. Let's get into the pros. It is pretty much a batteryless design. While the red dot that accompanies our ACOG has a battery, and no, don't buy the fiber optic RMR, at the end of the day, you still have a batteryless option, which is good. ACOGs are typically known for poor eye relief, which is absolutely true, but it sort of forgets that there are other ACOGs on the market. The TA31, by far the most popular, yes, it has bad eye relief. But if that is an issue, there are other options like the TA33, which is just all in on eye relief being good, or the TA11, which is a compromise, middle ground between the low eye relief, high field of view, and the all eye relief, no field of view options, right? So there are options available to you here. The ACOG, specifically the TA31, as I mentioned, has a very large actual and apparent field of view. So while we only have 4x, a field of view in this manner with a large apparent field of view actually feels a lot like a 5x or a 6x just because it's so much easier to see. I've used the analogy before, but it's like when we were kids playing on, Xbox or something. And a lot of us would be like right up next to the TV because it's easier to see when it's right next to you. You can see more even though you technically, sitting on the couch, would see the exact same thing. The same thing is occurring here. While this is becoming less and less the case, the ACOG reticle is still one of the easiest and cleanest reticle to use on the market. So though that being said, the market is finally beginning to catch up in this regard, and this is probably not going to remain true for much longer. But compared to a lot of other options, the ACOG reticle is incredibly clean and very finely etched. The price. So a lot of people view the ACOG as ridiculously expensive, and to a degree it absolutely is. But for about $1,000 less if you're willing to buy used, you can typically snag a good ACOG, throw it on a Hall Sun on top, and you end up with a package that is less than $1,500, often less than $1,300, ready to go. That's not an insignificant amount of money, but then when you consider you've got the best-in-class optic choice, that's actually not terrible. Furthermore, the fiber optic. In a world where LPVOs have 15 hours of battery life to get you barely daylight visible, a ACOG gets you beyond daylight bright with a batteryless design, which is awesome. Actually, too awesome in some cases, and you have to put tape over the top because it's too damn bright, but it's a great thing to have. Durability. While red dots are certainly incredibly durable, the ACOG has that track record of just being a literal tank and an extremely simple design, and while I would argue most of these options are very durable, far more durable than you could probably require or probably need, some people really like that peace of mind. Next up, weight. The ACOG is the ultimate weight-conscious option. Right? The RMR ACOG package is somewhere around 16-17 ounces, which is by far the lightest option in this category. The red dots are right there with it. Also, passive aiming. The red dot still takes the cake here, right? Because it is typically you can get far more capable red dots for passive aiming, but the RMR or Hall Sun on top of the ACOG still offers acceptable passive aiming. Finally, and this is actually often not mentioned, has the fastest swap between the 1X and the 4X. There's a lot of times where you come up on target with the 1X, you shoot a shot and you're like, this isn't good enough. And you either quickly or even during recoil switch to the 4X and engage the target. Similarly, if you're shooting a moving or awkward target, you might be on the 4X and you're just like, this isn't working. And once again, during recoil or right afterwards, in a split second, you can switch to that 1X and engage the target. That is really nice. All right, let's get into the cons, because there are a lot of cons with the ACOG package, unlike what a lot of people seem to indicate. Number one, the ACOG is slave to a BDC. And while there are a lot of models available to you, and if you don't have the specific model but you have a similar velocity, you can use stray lock to match the BDC to the ACOG in a manner that is basically analogous. However, this requires time, chronograph, understanding of zeros, and fucks to be given. Some people just don't want to deal with that. But at the end of the day, you are slaved to a BDC system, and more specifically, you are slaved to Triticons' utter denial or reluctance to switch up the game and offer more modern reticle options in their ACOGs. You get the same circle dot chevron thing or some weird other crap that I don't really understand. There was for a brief moment that Primary Arms Aurora ACOG that they co-made or whatever you want to call it, but that seems to have fallen through, so that is no longer being made, unfortunately. Which is sad because that offered just enough subtle but impactful changes to really modernize the ACOG reticle design. Another issue, the ACOGs have noticeable parallax. Up and down, not terrible. But if you stay within the image, that is no black forms on the left or right, and move your head around, you will shift by about 2 to 3 inches, maybe more, actually definitely more, at about 400 to 500 yards. If you don't have your head perfectly centered behind the optic, we're not talking about the eye box, we're talking about parallax. You will miss your shots. There's a reason why the military typically teaches, because a lot of their guns still have front sight blocks on them, or front sight posts on them, to use the shadow of the front sight post to reference where you are within the parallax. As you can see, the shadow move left and right. But at the end of the day, if you don't have that, and a lot of us don't have a front sight block gun, you're going to have to contend with pretty noticeable parallax. Moving on, the RMR, while really great under nods, is kind of a dated option nowadays because you have to remove it to replace the battery, which is kind of a pain in the ass. And the Holosun option, which is not only cheaper, but can have the battery replaced, isn't the best under night vision. It works on a moonlit night, however, if it's darker than that, especially if you're away from a city, like 50 miles away from a city or more, you'll find the Holosuns typically don't get dim enough to be properly used under night vision. You kind of just have this glowing thing floating above your ACOG. The aiming methodology of the 1X is really bad. It works. Yes, absolutely it works. But a piggyback mounted RDS is very, very high up there. And I know it's all the rage right now to get heads up shooting position, but this is beyond heads up shooting position. You will be shooting with a full-blown chin weld. And even with a lot of training, and I have a lot of time with the setup because I really enjoy it, a chin weld is slower into action, less consistent, and you lose a much more solid point of contact with your rifle. Thus, you lose some of your recoil management. Now, the gun is going to move about the same amount, but your head relative to the gun will shift a lot more, making the recoil pattern much more difficult to manage. The inverse of the price. So while ACOGs, in my eyes, are actually cheap for what you get, if that's not what you want or that's not in your budget range, you're basically shit out of luck. Right? Magnification. While I said the ACOG field of view gives you a lot more than the 4X might imply, that's only true for starters for the 4X TA31 model, and far less true for the TA11. But at the end of the day, it's still 4X, right? And while there does exist the 6X ACOG model, but it weighs more than my dog, so maybe not a great option. At the end of the day, we're stuck to 4X, like functionally stuck to 4X, and a lightweight 6X option like Vortex provides would be nice, but that doesn't exist. It also costs a lot. Moving on, the ACOG requires a lot of training, as I mentioned. The ACOG eye relief is not intuitive if you've used other optics on the market. It requires nose to charging handle style shooting. It has that parallax issue I mentioned, which is going to require some technique. If you've done long range shooting, you're probably already familiar with this. But even the 1X shooting with the RMR, which should in theory be the most intuitive, is actually very difficult to use. And a lot of people that use ACOG stacks but don't actually practice with them a lot, I see them defaulting to the 4X even at 20 yards, which is not ideal. In short, I say this a lot, and a lot of people think it is because on paper it sounds like it should be, but the ACOG and dot is not comparable to an LPVO. Very much like the red dot magnifier situation, this is a flipped version of that, where we've gone all in on the ACOG and the red dot on top is sort of a secondary consideration. The benefits and the faults of the ACOG are really one and the same. The ACOG is laser focused on doing one thing and one thing only, which is good and bad. What is that one thing? Well, it's running an ACOG, which is good if you really want an ACOG, but really bad if you're trying to kind of shoehorn the setup to do LPVO things. Let's restate things to kind of wind things down. To me, the choices are fairly simple when you consider the strengths and weaknesses. The red dot magnifier is a primarily 1X oriented system. Thus, if that is your primary concern, 1X, then you should probably narrow in on this. This still gets you the magnification that you need to take low percentage close range shots and medium range shots. Is it ideal? No, but we're going after 1X, and that's where we decided to make our compromise. The ACOG is the flip version of that. We're willing to kind of forego 1X if we decide we don't really need it nearly as much, and get a really nice 4X aiming option on top. Specifically if you want the ACOG 4X experience. So it's really good, in my opinion, for maximizing builds where rugged, lightweight, simple systems are desired. Finally, there exists the LPVO that puts just enough juice into each category to be adequate. You have enough performance to be 90% on par with all the other options, but you're not quite there yet at maximizing the capability. You have roughly the speed of a red dot sight, but not as fast. Roughly the intuitiveness of a red dot sight, but not as intuitive. But you have that max magnification options. This is why, in most scenarios, I typically gravitate towards an LPVO as a catch-all option. It is the option where, when you don't know what you're up against, it kind of covers the most bases, with the red dot magnifier being close behind. I typically gravitate towards the ACOG setup for more mountainous setups where weight and durability are king, as I mentioned, and I typically gravitate towards red dot magnifier setups for dedicated night vision setups or extremely urban-oriented setups with a different caliber. And then obviously just red dots on PDWs typically. But to me, the red dot magnifier and ACOG stack are more niche, while the LPVO is general. I think the red dot magnifier runs really close to what LPVOs are capable of. I just prefer LPVOs because it's a much more flatlined experience in terms of capability across the board. Some other considerations before we wrap this shit up. 2.5, like a low magnified scope that has no 1x. So let's say a 2 to 10 or a 2.5 to 10x plus a red dot. I think a lot of people are gravitating towards this because they see the dot on top of LPVOs and think that dot is there as the 1x. And I don't think that's true at all. To me, that dot is there for night vision performance. And like I said with the ACOG, it's not a good 1x for just 1x shooting, in my opinion. Thus, the setup right here is just the extreme version of the ACOG. However, for a fighting rifle, this doesn't make sense to me. The 1x is unoptimal and significantly slower, but the magnification is well beyond the capability required for a fighting rifle, and you're spending a lot of weight on that, and bulk. The LCAN. Well, this video, as I close out, I will simp for my LCAN. I think this is a big reason why I gravitate towards the LCAN. It's very compelling, even when you consider the price. You get the 1x of an LPVO, actually typically better than a lot of 1x's on LPVOs. You get the ACOG's 4x, both field of view and the likes. You actually get a better eye relief, significantly better eye relief than the 4x ACOG. But you don't have to deal with the 1x of a piggybacked or offset red dot system. You have it in line like an LPVO. And unlike the LPVOs, you get a daylight bright illumination that lasts for about 3 months on constant on a very bright setting, allowing you to pick it up and roll at all times. The massive field of view, both apparent and actual, means scanning at 4x is effective, but we also have a very wide open 1x. It's durable, it's 100% functional without a battery, and weighs less than actually most LPVOs. Now, it's not all the end-all and be-all, and we're completely off the reservations when we're talking about the topic of this video, but yeah, gotta squeeze an LCAN in there somehow, right? Okay, I'm gonna cut this shit off. Let's go. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this was helpful. Remember, this is just my experience. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're all really, really good as long as you buy quality options. It's just how I view it, because a lot of people ask me which one I would go for and when, and it's, as you've seen, this is a long-ass video. It's a complicated answer. So hopefully that was enjoyable for you, and I will see you around.
That park is not so good, bro, which makes no sense. We're not moving. Nova, here. Filming the repair of the car. Nova, come here.